No, I think that the truth is that central bankers have been enormously surprised about not just the amount of inflation, but the persistence of inflation and the extent to which inflation has spread from, if you like, the usual suspects in terms of most obviously energy prices and food prices, through to other parts of the economy. So a lot of other goods prices started rising shortly after the first shocks on semiconductors and second-hand cars and so on. And now you've got not just service sector prices going up, but you've also got wage pressures beginning to emerge. Now, admittedly, real wages are still falling, but the point is that nominal wages are rising faster than is really consistent with the idea of hitting an inflation target of, say, 2%. So wherever you are in the world, I mean, there are one or two exceptions. China's got very low inflation, but broadly speaking, wherever you are in the world, inflation is higher than it should be. It's been higher than it should be for much longer than people had expected. And it's not clear at this stage that monetary policy is quite delivering what it's supposed to be delivering in reducing inflation. The problem, actually, I think, in many ways, is that once inflation is established, it becomes not just a technical challenge, it becomes a political and social challenge as well, because inflation is profoundly unfair, it's profoundly undemocratic, and once you establish it, there's always a sense that some people, some groups are left behind, and they will always want to push for their own compensation for the inflation that's taking place. So what takes place in terms of an increase in prices 1 year becomes an increase in wages the following year, and unless monetary policy is being tightened enough, the danger is that you have this kind of process that builds over a period of time. And I think there is evidence of that now.
But isn't the problem that it's not the central bankers who are guilty here? I mean, Milton Friedman, famously said, everywhere it is a monetary phenomenon, right?
Yes.
And I guess we all accept that thesis, largely. But what's happening is that governments are using whatever tools at their disposal to undermine the actions that the central bankers are taking to tighten monetary conditions. And it seems peculiar to me that they all want to give the same message, but when you look at what governments are doing by putting energy caps in, we had Bruno Le Maire talking about it this morning. Everywhere you look, they are using benefits and they are encouraging businesses through quasi-support programs.
Yep.
All of this is working against the actions of the central banks, who don't seem to be able to understand why their 18 months of rate increases have not forced faster deceleration in demand.
Well, I think you've been quite kind to the central banks themselves, if I must say so, because if you look at what happened, say, in 2020, you had tremendous fiscal support, which I think was the right thing to do. You're building a sort of financial bridge between a pre-COVID world and a post-COVID world, so that was right. But at the same time, you had central banks behaving as if we're on the verge of a second Great Depression. They were really worried about not just the collapse in GDP, but also the dangers that might have come through in terms of collapsing equity markets, collapsing banking system, collapsing labour markets, but none of those things actually happened. So I think the reality is that there was a huge monetary expansion, which goes back to Milton Friedman. I mean, I'm not a monetarist, but it's important to stress that there was this huge monetary expansion. And once it started to filter through in terms of rising asset prices, more spending power for people, suddenly it became increasingly obvious that rather than inflation falling, which is what you would have expected normally when you have a big collapse in activity, inflation was beginning to rise. And initially, central banks said, no, this is all transitory. It's nothing to do with us. It's all to do with external shocks. But the problem then is that if every central bank everywhere in the world says it's an external shock, well, where's the external shock coming from? Is it Mars? Is it Jupiter? Is it Saturn? It becomes a problem.